Lally Weymouth, thanks for sitting down with us. Do you remember the Pentagon Papers episode and the publishing, the moment that your mother, Katherine Graham, made the decision to publish?
Of course I remember it, and I remember the drama around it. And of course she was, as you know, she took over the paper after my father died, and this was a big moment for her because it was a very big decision, as you know, because it wasn't just about publishing the Pentagon Papers. It was also a business decision for us, for her, for our company, because we were about to have an IPO. We were about to take our company public. Mm-hmm. And of course, many people, many of the lawyers thought that that could be threatened by actually publishing the Pentagon Papers.
When your mother took over the paper,
mm-hmm.
I'll just start with that. What did you think?
Well, actually, the reason Alison plays me in the movie is that I didn't really think. She was very decisive, my mother. She knew that she wanted to run the company, which she had no experience, as she knew well herself, to do. Because my father, who had been a very glamorous, powerful, smart figure, and who had just died at a young age, she had really been at home raising 4 kids, taking us to football games, and the things that kids do.
Mm-hmm.
And so she knew very well that she had no business experience, and she really had never worked on a 9-to-5 job, as so many women do today, of course. So it was a very different era.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually wrote her first speech to the board. I was then a freshman in Radcliffe.
That is quite amazing, because did she ask you to do that, and you were that confident as a freshman
at Radcliffe?
I
honestly can't remember how it happened, but she saved this speech.
Mm-hmm.
And when she wrote her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, she published the speech again. And I remember I used to write for New York Magazine before I wrote for the Post.
Mm-hmm.
And the editor of New York Magazine told me that it was a great speech you wrote. And I guess I did have the confidence to say we're not going to sell the paper. There were a lot of rumors that we were going to sell the paper when my father died.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew what I wanted to say, that we were not going to sell the paper, that we were going to run it, and that she was going to carry on the tradition of my father, and so on and so forth. It was more complicated than that. But that's what Alison is talking about when she talks to Meryl Streep in the movie as me.
But you felt at the time, with your mother, that she was the person who could do this. That she could take over the paper.
Well, I have to say that she was very decisive about it. I mean, she knew that she was very, very very unsure about many things, but she was very sure about one thing, that she was going to carry on and that she was going to run the Washington Post, which her father had bought at an auction, which he had given to my father to run. And my father had done a fantastic job running.
Mm-hmm.
And she was determined that she was going to do it in spite of her lack of experience. So I knew what the speech had to say.
When I was at the Washington Post, when I started in the mid-1980s or the late 1980s, your mother was a figure in the newsroom, in the building. And so by the time that we were coming around to sort of towards the end of the century, you know her as this supremely confident person. What's so fascinating about the movie, which is based on her memoir, is that there was that moment where she wasn't that confident person, and we're seeing that happen in the film. We're seeing that evolution and that pivot point.
I think that's true. She used to practice even her speech to the staff, her Christmas speech. After all, I'm very in my bedroom with my brothers. I'm very happy to be here at Christmas, if you can believe it.
Wow!
And as you said, 25 years later, she could make a terrific speech. She had a speechwriter and all those things that most public figures have, but she had gained a lot of confidence 25 to 30 years later. But she'd worked at it, I've got to say. She studied business, she worked hard, she met Warren Buffett, she evolved. And I think a lot of hard work went into that evolution.
So here she is faced with this decision, right, which the movie is really about. When the Pentagon Papers have been leaked to the New York Times, and then the New York Times publishes them, and then is enjoined from publishing any further. She's now facing a very serious decision as a new publisher, as you pointed out, with the company about to IPO, with pressure from the bankers. And she has
and pressure from our lawyers.
And from lawyers, and also, you have to say, pressure from the newsroom. She had hired this kind of firebrand, passionate editor in Ben Bradley, who wanted to raise the bar at the paper, wanted to make it one of the great papers, and at the time the Washington Post was an aspiration, but it hadn't been achieved at that time. What do you remember about that, the dilemma and the sort of agony she might have gone through in that decision-making process?
Well, I think that Spielberg did a great job in the movie showing, although of course the board wasn't exactly the board that he portrays in the film, but nevertheless, he shows the advisors being sort of against, especially the business advisors being against publishing. But the lead business advisor, who was called Fritz Beebe, who was not much fun, I've got to say, but he kind of left the door open to her. He kind of said to her, you know, he left the door open. He didn't adamantly say you can't publish. He said, you know, basically, it's not advisable, but you can publish. You know, he left the door open, and I think he was the person she really relied on. And I think that once he left the door open, they called her, and she did want to publish, of course, and she liked Ben, and she hired Ben and fired our old managing editor, whom we as kids adored, and his kids were our best friends.
Who's that? It was
Alfred Friendly.
Wow.
And so
that's a pretty big decision in itself.
Yes, it was a very big decision, but it was obviously the right decision. He was a fantastic editor, and they were a great duo, I think.
Well, they're definitely a great duo, and it's the interaction between them is really wonderful in the film, and the interaction, you know, between them in real life. There's many wonderful pictures of the two of them. There's many wonderful anecdotes that we've heard about them. It's also interesting that it seemed that your mother relied on you for advice, and relied on you as a sounding board. Is that something that's very vivid to you in your memory in terms of how you?
Well, I think both my brother and my brother Don and myself, my mother liked to redo decisions. She was actually, although she did make this decision, boom, as my brother points out, she often would, you know, agonize over decisions, and I have to say I share that trait. And my brother does not share that trait. And so I sympathize, and I think she would sound it out both on me and Don, and, you know, what do you think? And she'd present us with both, and other people too, other friends. I think she'd, you know, run it by a series of people, and then finally she would make up her mind. But it was hard for her.
Did you think about it at the time of here is your mother in basically a sea of men? This is how it's portrayed in the film, and I actually saw a still, I don't know if it was related to the film, but there is a photo of her in the boardroom, and it's just her. She's the only woman surrounded by all these men. Was it striking to you at the time, or is it more in retrospect that we think?
I think it's more in retrospect. At the time, I think it was so unusual for a woman to be in the role she was in, because after all, my father had been the one that was in the role, and my mother had been at home, as I pointed out to you, taking us to the Safeway grocery store.
Right.
And and taking us on tours of the White House and whatever. You know, doing most of my parents' friends were pretty traditional couples. You know, the women didn't work, they raised the kids, and so, you know, no.
They also ran the government, because apparently
the men ran the government,
right.
But the women didn't run the government.
Right, right. But
I mean, Felix Frankfurter or James Preston or whatever. That's right. The men did run the government.
Well, so in that way, they were maybe not so typical.
No,
to other families.
But I'm just saying it was a more traditional setup between the men and the women.
Of course, yeah.
In the sense that you didn't have a Ruth Bader Ginsburg as you do today, and you didn't have these outstanding women that you have today running corporations and doing so many things.
Right, right. Well, she was definitely a trailblazer in that regard. Did she reveal her fears to you? Did you see her in those moments of uncertainty and?
Yes, and I think that you know, like everybody, she was always. I think the next big drama was Watergate, of course.
Of course.
When you know, we were all worried. There was no security at the house, and Mitchell made that remark about. I can't even quote it, but it was very aggressive, and we were worried that
John Mitchell made a crude remark about about your mom.
And everybody was worried that our television licenses might be taken away. My father had bought a lot of television stations. Nixon hated the Washington Post, and so we were worried about our television licenses being taken away.
Right. It's on the tapes.
Yeah.
Some of the tapes that are played in the film, and it's on the Nixon tapes that are in the presidential library.
Right, but we didn't have access to the tapes.
Of course.
But so without having access to the tapes, we were not stupid, and so therefore everybody was worried about that.
Right.
And so that was a very, very next big hurdle that she faced, I think, was Watergate. And I think it was her next really big triumph when it turned out. There were months, of course, I think it was, I hope my memory's not wrong, but there were months when I think it was CBS or, no, we were out there publishing for months and months the Watergate stories with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein sneaking into this garage. And, you know, she kept saying, well, why isn't anybody, it's such a great story, why isn't anybody else publishing it? And I think finally, if my memory doesn't serve me wrong, it was CBS or somebody picked it up, and everybody was like, oh, thank God, you know, we're not out here alone. And then, of course, you know, the whole Watergate saga unfolded, and it turned out to be true. But there, you know, that was a very hard period for her, I think.
And much longer than the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah, much longer,
months.
And much more drawn. And really, when the Post was absolutely the center of attention, and Woodward and Bernstein were the center of attention, and it was very difficult.
Talk a little bit about Ben Bradlee's relationship with your mother, Katherine Graham.
I think they just had a great relationship. She respected him, and I think he respected her. I think they were a great team.
It's kind of an unusual. It's a kind of a love story between them in a way, you know.
I don't know about a love story, but I think they respected each other, liked each other, and he respected her, and she learned from him, and he learned from her. I think it was a great partnership.
It is. It's an unusual partnership because she coming in at the time untested as she had been, and then thrown into a moment of a huge test, and she had to decide whether she was going to really back this decision she'd made to hire this firebrand editor who was going to lead the paper and to greatness, supposedly, right? Which he did, of course. But it requires so much trust and so much kind of balancing, because he was this huge personality, but he didn't face the business implications that she did over publishing a story or
But I think that ultimately they understood each other. And I think ultimately he obviously had to understand the implications.
Right. Well, there's a scene in the movie where his wife says to him, "You're not risking anything." I thought that was interesting. It's Katherine Graham who's risking all
that was
here.
Great, I thought.
And that was an interesting insight, and a kind of moment of truth-telling between her and Ben Bradlee.
Yeah.
And it's kind of true, because he could go on to glory whether or not you know, it had financial implications for the paper. Not to say that he didn't care about that, but that was her responsibility, really.
Yeah.
What do you think of as her legacy today, as we look at how much change has happened, both for women and so much change in the media as well? When you think about how she would look at all of the what's going on today.
I just think it's too hard. It's too hard to speculate.
One of the things that I've thought about in having seen the film and putting this series together is how few women publishers there still are today, and that your mother remains kind of a unique figure in what she created and what she stepped into and what she became.
That's true, but I think also the industry has changed so much, and the industry is having a very hard time, as you know, due to the internet and due to all the changes.
Yes.
And so it's a different industry than the one I grew up with.
Oh, it's very different. I don't think anyone ever thought that newspapers could go away. It seemed like such a permanent part of our lives. That's one of the things that I thought when I wanted to become a reporter. I thought, well, we'll never run out of news. Yeah. So I'll always have job security.
We didn't run out of news. We just ran out of papers working as a business.
Yeah, that's true. I obviously didn't occur to me that there could be something like the internet that would come along. But at the same time, it's also been a huge evolution for women, and there's a discussion now, and there's a desire to see more women's leadership. Is that something that you think your mother was consciously aware of wanting to represent, being a leader in that in that mode, or is it just something that was kind of a byproduct of her being placed through historical circumstances in that position and her stepping into that role?
I mean, I think it's just too far, too long ago to say. But I think she would have been, I mean, no, I think it's too long ago. You just can't say.
She worked all the way through, let's see, when did she
died in 2001.
She died in 2001, but she retired well before that.
Exactly.
In the 80s, Don was already the publisher, must have been early 90s, late 80s maybe, is that about right?
Yeah.
And
no, but she became the chairman.
She became the chairman, so she stayed involved in the paper for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Well,
and then she wrote a book.
Right, exactly. Can you share sort of what are some of your own, something that your mother gave to you, told you as your own, as a woman, and you're a writer and a very successful writer and a journalist who's traveled the world and met world leaders and written about that. I mean, what do you feel she gave to you?
I can't say specifically what she gave to me other than, you know, she was an excellent mother, but I thought she was very funny in a certain way. She loved news. I called her once from Rome, and I was spending a weekend at the Pope's summer palace. And I told her, I was writing a column about this weekend at John Paul II's home, private home. It was very few people, 20 people were invited. And I said, you just won't believe what happened, but it was the weekend of Bill Clinton's Monica Lewinsky, the whole thing was revealed. And I said, you won't believe that the Pope actually asked me, you know, what's going on in Washington. So I was planning to use this as the lead of a column I was writing for the Post. Next thing I know, I get back, and she thought it was so entertaining that she leaked it to the style section. But I thought that her love of news was fantastic. She just couldn't contain herself. And I'm like, I said to her, well, you know, I was planning to use this as my lead, and she's like, I just couldn't help it. You know, I loved the story. You know, so I thought that was
you had to forgive
adorable.
her.
Yeah,
she stole your lead.
Exactly, but she couldn't resist a good story.
That's so great. That's so great.
She loved the news. You know,
she called me with tips sometimes.
Yeah.
I remember she called me with a tip about Mike Nichols one time, and she'd been with Mike Nichols.
She was very friendly with Mike Nichols.
Yes, I can't say what it was because it was off the record. But Mike Nichols is no longer with us either. But yeah, even me, sort of a style reporter at the time, she would call me with a tip. So, but stealing her daughter's lead, that's kind of.
That was kind of cute, though.
You could say it's cute, or you could say it's over the line. I'm glad you think it's cute.
But I thought it was in a way went to show her, you know, love of the sport, a love of the game, right?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic story. Thank you so much, Lally, for spending the time with us.
It was really nice of you.
Thank you.